Thank you. And so I will keep an eye out at the back, but I can't see you quite as well, so feel free to wait. We'll come to that in a minute. So I'd really like to start by asking Bram about pictures that we're seeing on the screen behind us, which are from a new documentary that he's making called Sahara, about the Sahara as the new southern border of Europe. But when we were chatting earlier this evening, I was thinking to myself, actually, it's not really very new for Europe's border to be the Sahara, because I remember in 1990, I went to visit the border of Europe and the Sahara, and I've got a great photograph of myself, one of my favourite of all time, standing next to a stone wall. It's about this high, and it's in quite good condition actually. And that wall was built by the Romans. It was the Roman limes, the southern border of the Roman Empire, and it was built in the 1st century AD. So there's nothing so much new about this idea, but the Romans thought that this wall, yay high, was going to keep people out. And the question is, do the de facto walls, in terms of the border patrols and the military missions and the police missions and so on, that the EU has been constructing, do they actually constitute an effective border of Europe either?
Well, they're trying to. So in the last 11 months, I've been traveling through the Sahara with exactly that, those glasses. Like, you know, the Sahara has become Europe's southernmost border. It's no longer the Mediterranean. Actually, we're moving back into the Sahara quite big. I mean, the Italians have just announced that they are now also sending soldiers to Niger to stop migrants. The Germans are putting up military camps also in Niger. The French are already there in Mali, in Niger, in Chad. So, I mean, basically the Sahara is being militarized on a very rapid scale in order to fight everything that we fear, basically. And so that's actually the new modern border, because officially it's not, you know, the borders are somewhere else, but meanwhile, politically they have become new borders. But I've become quite obsessed with borders in the last 10 years of my work, actually, because I love border towns. You know, they're full of shady people, smugglers, refugees, migrants, soldiers, police officers, and it's a gray zone. You know, it's nor this nor that. And I always say, like, borders create countries, not the other way around. You know, because we have borders, we can say this is us and that's them. And that, of course, is always a complete fictional idea. It's an idea that was created in the 19th century, that every nation should have its own state. But people effectively living in those borderlands don't feel it like that at all. So what I have here is a nice collection of the work that I did the last 10 years along the borders. And the first one I want to show you is a remarkable border between Turkey and Armenia. Now, obviously, you know that Turkey and Armenia have this terrible history of the First World War, the Armenian genocide. And the border between Turkey and Armenia has been closed since the early 90s, actually, because of the war in Nagorno-Karabakh. So they're officially enemies, the Christian versus the Muslim. But when you go there, it turns out that the border, in fact, is only a little river. And where the people, the Turks and Armenians, are living so close to each other that they can even hear, when the other one is setting the table, they can hear the glasses, they can hear the plates, you know? And when they have weddings, they can hear the music playing, and the Turks say to each other, I'm sure that's actually a Turkish song they're playing there. And so I went to the other side of the border, which would be very easy, because you can actually just jump over the river and then you're in Armenia, but it's not allowed because there's Russian border guards and they will shoot you if you do that. So what you have to do instead, you have to go all the way through Georgia, which is a trip of 2 days, in order to get to that other little village. And you come there, and guess what? When you ask them about the weddings on the other side, they say, I would swear it's an Armenian song they're singing. So anyway, so I just want to give you a little bit of a video when we went to that, you know, what it looks like, that border town. There we go. Hoppa.
We reizen naar de gesloten grens tussen Turkije en Armenië. Ik probeer me voor te stellen hoe hier in 1915 duizenden over die stenen zijn geklauterd. Haastig. De christelijke Armeniërs naar het oosten, de moslims naar het westen. Een grens met een heel verhaal. Een grens die ontzag inboezemt. Daar aan de andere kant begint een heel andere wereld. Dit is de grens. Daar Armenië, de christenen en hier de Turken. En dit riviertje is alles wat ze scheidt. En in de zomer wordt het hier nog veel smaller, zo smal dat je hinkstapsprong naar de andere kant zou kunnen. Maar dat mag niet. Er staat zelfs een boete op contact tussen de twee dorpen hier. En de soldaten aan beide kanten van deze grensrivier die letten erop dat het niet gebeurt. Voilà. Gitti. Hayırlı olsun.
Teşekkürler.
Yardım istiyor musun?
Yok yok sağ ol yok.
Sizce Ermeniler nasıl?
Ya göründüğü kadarıyla bizim bir zararları yok yani. Onlar suyun o tarafında, biz bu tarafında. Yani bize ne bizim onlara bir zararımız var ne de onların bize bir zararı var. İki iyi komşu gibi geçiniyoruz yani. Başka da bir şey yok. Bazen
Konuşuyor mu? Armenileriyle.
onlar genelde suyun kenarına gelmezler. O bana bir şey yapmıyor ki benden korksun. Korkulacak bir durum yok yani. Piknik amacıyla geliyorlar. Kafkasya'da yaşayan milletler birbirinden etkilenmişler yani. Şöyle, ben gözümü yumduğum zaman onların müziğini dinlediğim zaman sadece yani Kafkas müziğini dinliyorum. Öyle geliyor bana. Sadece işte söyledikleri zaman Ermenice söylüyorlar. Yani dile döndüğü zaman Ermenice müzik, ritim olarak aynı Kafkas müziği ta kendi.
Okay, so there you have it. So there you have it. You know, it's like, you know, it's Caucasian. It's not Turkish, Armenian. It's okay, Caucasian. Completely, you know, redefinition of who we are. And there's one funny story that you know, one summer day, there was an Armenian guy on one side and a Turkish guy on the other side, and they were both fishing. You know, and then their fishing rods, they hit each other and they got entangled. So here you had this scene of the Turk and the Armenian, the Christian and the Muslim that were pulling, you know, each other almost into the river, and eventually they had to solve this because, you know, their lives were in danger because the Russian soldiers were getting angry, so they had to cut the lines. Anyway, so I mean, basically, I grew up in a time where borders were receding, right? I mean, you know, apartheid fell, the Berlin Wall fell, but what we're seeing now, of course, is this, you know, this re-emerging of borders and border walls and fences on, you know, the Greek-Turkish border, now in the Sahara. I mean, borders are hip again, you know, they're fashionable. And then there's always the guys that have to be on the border and, you know, and play these silly games. So I think the most interesting case of that is Cyprus, where, you know, since 1974 there's a green zone between the Greeks and the Turks, and they were killing each other, so the only way to deal with that is put the United Nations there. And so you have on both sides, you have Greek and Turkish guards, you know, who are just bored out of their skull, because since 1974 there was not even one shot ever fired, you know, so they're just getting bored there. So we met up with a cartoonist who lives right on that border and who observes those soldiers on both sides. And he has such a funny story to tell, you know, about how that life on the border is.
So there's never any confrontation between the Turkish separatists?
Not say conflict. Maybe a Turkish soldier yell to the Greek soldier.
Like what?
Hey, Greek guy, how are you?
Yeah.
Hey, Turkish guy.
Yeah.
What do you want?
And then the United Nations has to come, right?
No.
But they have to come.
No. If the things go even further, let's say someone climbed the wall or starting throwing stones and stuff like that, then the guards will be here.
Yeah. You live here. Do you need him to guard this line? Do you need that soldier?
To be honest,
Yeah.
Even if you ask him,
Yeah.
he will say that he's useless here.
Well, let's ask him. Yeah? Yeah.
Φίλε, να σε ρωτήσω. Πιστεύεις ότι χρειάζεται να βάλω σκοπιά εκεί? Ή είναι βλακεία?
Να μην ξέρεις την τηλεόραση δηλαδή.
Στην Ολλανδία ρε φίλε, είναι μακριά.
Α, εντάξει. Εγώ πιστεύω δεν χρειάζεται.
Yeah. he thinks so, that he doesn't need to be on guard. If you place a camera over there and start filming every day, you're most probably going to laugh rather than cry with the situation over here, because it's sadly funny. Because you see, this is a result of a war, of an invention, but this guy, he's 18, 19, he's not more than that. He didn't leave the invasion, like the other guy, the Turkish one. He was brought here from Turkey, whatever city of Turkey was brought here, to serve to the army. For what? Probably for the rest of his military career, he's going to be here.
So, you know, so he's also explaining that they're making signs sometimes when they're doing push-ups, like I'm fucking your mother and that kind of thing. So they are like throwing stones at each other, extremely childish. So the last point I want to make, and because it's already beyond 5 minutes, I'm afraid, but just, you know, the new sense of borders, that's what you really get in the Sahara now. So we met up in Mauritania, which is on the westernmost side of the Sahara, right on the Atlantic Ocean, where the Spanish Coast Guard, the Guardia Civil, has been active there since 2005 already to stop the migrants going to the Canary Islands. But since the end of 2008, they have not even found one single immigrant. And yet, the Spanish are still there. So, just this is the start of my news.
Ik had gehoopt dat het ietsje warmer zou zijn, maar dit is wel een machtig mooi punt. Hè? Hier de Atlantische Oceaan en daar begint Afrika. Mauritaanse kust, het meest westelijke punt van de Sahara. En hier zijn we nota bene op patrouille met de Spaanse kustwacht. Qu'est-ce que les Espagnols font en Mauritanie?
Pour les aider pour la coopération entre la Mauritanie et l'Espagne.
C'est pas la frontière d'Espagne ici, hein?
Oui, mais d'ici, ils sont sortis beaucoup de pirogues avec clandestins jusqu'à l'île Canarie. Et l'île Canarie, c'est l'Espagne.
Et les migrants, ils sont pas ici? Quand est-ce que vous avez arrêté la dernière migrant?
C'était le fin 2008 exactement, c'était la fin 2008. Depuis 2009, il y a presque des pirogues exactement. Et après,
ça fait longtemps?
Ça fait longtemps, oui, ça fait longtemps.
So I mean, it's kind of I mean, I was just trying to imagine, you know, the Mauritanian Coast Guard in front of Ostende for the last 15 years. You know, I mean, would we ever accept anything like this? But apparently, it's totally normal when we talk about Africa. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you very much for getting us off to such a good start. And I want to turn to Kapka now, because she has looked very much at the human stories behind borders and borderlands. Particularly one of the borders that we just looked at between Greece and Turkey, but also Bulgaria. This is a very interesting part of the world. Some of the people who live along the border that Kapka has written about in this book, which I thoroughly recommend, have lived in several different countries over the course of the 20th century without ever leaving their village, because of course the borders have changed and who owns them has changed. Greece, of course, became independent. There was the whole period of communism, then the fall of the Berlin Wall, Bulgaria joining the European Union, and there's been a whole set of border policies that have been negotiated between the EU and Turkey. But those policy issues that we're used to talking about in Brussels are a very different thing from the lived experience of the human beings who reside there. Some of whom have resided there for a very long time. A wonderful map of the border. So, Kapka, what is it like being there? What are your favourite stories of the people who've actually had to navigate all of these border issues during their daily lives?
Well, maybe I should start by saying that it's not a very clear image, but hopefully you can get an idea of the parameters of the border that is, well, my border of the book. It's essentially a triple border shared by Turkey, Bulgaria and Greece, and it's geographically, in a way, the last border of Europe. It's the land route into Europe from Asia. So my journey took place along this triple border, and I spent time in various communities talking to people. And I should also start by saying that my fascination with borders, you said that you've become obsessed with borders. I wonder whether you were always obsessed with them, or you became so in the process of your work. But I grew up obsessed with borders simply because I grew up behind the Iron Curtain. So my knowledge of borders, my awareness of what a hard border is, even though it was never a physical awareness because the border zone was a no-go zone, so you couldn't even approach it you couldn't go within 20 or 30 kilometers from the actual physical border. It was all militarized. So no-go zone for civilians, but I had a hyper awareness of what a hard border is and what it felt like many in Eastern Europe, what it felt like to grow up behind the border. And interestingly, when I actually saw bits of what used to be the Iron Curtain, I'll show you an image, if I can. Thank you. How do I shrink this?
Is that one?
This is an archival image from the 80s. It looks like a fairly simple sort of, the official name for this was the installation. It was an electrified barbed wire fence which separated Bulgaria. This is literally the last stretch, the southern easternmost stretch of the Iron Curtain, separated Bulgaria from Greece and Turkey. And it was always patrolled by soldiers who are under instructions to shoot and kill fugitives. So when I went back to that border, the border of my childhood as it were, I wanted to see what was left of it physically, but also humanly, and what the human legacy of that border is. I ended up writing about much more because it's still a land route of migration, so it became a multi-layered kind of journey. But my primary interest was in the legacy of the Iron Curtain, and I'll show you how this same stretch looks now as nature takes over. How did you shrink it before?
That one, yeah.
And this is now the border between Bulgaria and Turkey, or Bulgaria and Turkey?
Bulgaria and Turkey, very near the Black Sea, that particular stretch. Just a few kilometers from the Black Sea. This is how it looks now. This is me standing by the same stretch. So nature has taken over. These are some of the last bits of the actual Iron Curtain still standing. Most of it has been sold for scrap by locals. Literally the scrap heap of history. And I want to show you the maritime border. This is the natural maritime border between Bulgaria and Turkey. So between the EU and Turkey. Which is a fairly non-eventful place today. It's very peaceful, but back in the days of the Cold War, this whole area was heavily militarized. And there were lots of stories of Eastern Europeans coming to Bulgarian beaches on holiday, especially Germans, East Germans, who would then make a run for the border, and a lot of cases of people being shot and buried in unmarked graves. So I was interested in all of these stories. Some people actually tried swimming, or going on inflated mattresses from Bulgarian sea territory into Turkish territory. The vast majority of them died, but there were some interesting successful cases, including a hot air balloon escape by a German couple, I think in the 70s. So this was my primary interest. Even though these images I'm showing you are mostly devoid of people, the book ended up being all about people, the people of the border. This is a surviving. You said that the towers. You showed us a tower.
The Russian towers.
The Russian towers.
Yeah, the Russians are still controlling the old Soviet borders, basically, on the request of the Armenians, funny enough.
Is that right?
Yeah, because they said that the Armenians wouldn't do as good a job as Russians would. Which, I mean, they liberated from the Soviet Union, but we still want them as border guards,
Yeah, I guess the Soviet surveillance system has some history to
it.
But this is one of the surviving Soviet towers. In a border village, which was literally cut by the electrified barbed fence. And I actually wanted to give you a little taster of what the people of the border were faced with during the Cold War. Even though a lot of the stories in the book are about people now, most of them are about living people. There are a few snippets of the recent past. So this is a true story that was told to me by a local. And it's about a place called The Judgment. It's on the Bulgarian-Greek border, which is today a very soft border because it's between two EU countries. But back then, and through the 90s in fact, before Bulgaria joined the EU, it was still a hard and deadly border. So this is what life was like for the locals on the Bulgarian side. The Judgment is the name of a cliff over a border gorge. The gorge is so deep, you can't see the bottom, only mist. The following story was told to me by a local as we stood by Border Pyramid, number 47. This happened in 1981. The young couple had been perhaps Czechs. Nobody said any more, and we were too scared to ask, he said. They'd been moving in the direction of the Judgment. It was late summer, harvest time, and they managed to cross the electrified barbed fence without setting it off and entered an allotment in no man's land. Except there was a man, and they could see him working with his back to them, and they could see the basket with his lunch. Now let us imagine multiple takes of this story. In the first take, the Czech couple took the lunch. When the man turned and saw his lunch was missing, he guessed what had happened, but had the choice of keeping it to himself. In the second take, the Czech couple took the lunch and left some German marks. When the man turned, he guessed what had happened, but now he had a dilemma. Extra zealous cadres were deployed in border areas to test the locals' loyalty through various ruses. Things could go wrong very quickly if you failed the test. If the missing lunch and the marks were a test and he said nothing, he'd be deported with his family or sent to a labor camp. His life would be destroyed within hours. If the missing lunch was genuine and he reported the fugitives, he'd be highly commended, but he'd live with it for the rest of his days. In the third take, the couple didn't take the lunch and arrived in Greece ravenous. That man looking in the fields was our neighbor, the local said to me. Of course, he was highly commended, but he stopped going to his allotment, and his own judgment ate him up like a cancer.
So interesting, because I had exactly the same story of a Turkish man who caught his Armenian neighbor swimming over the river, and when he saw him, I said, "Did you greet him?" No, I locked him up, and then I called the border police. You know, it's like his neighbor, but exactly for the same, you know, like if you don't, then you're going to look like you're not, a patriot. Yeah.
So what were the consequences?
Well, they arrested him, and I don't know, but I mean, to me it was like such an odd. It's your very neighbor. You're looking out on him on every day. Why would you do that? You know?
But also the conflict between your identity and your loyalty,
Yeah.
because your local identity and loyalty are to your neighbour, the one you're living with, the one who's
exactly.
growing their food next to yours. But then you're expected to have another loyalty to your country, to regime, and you're tested on it. this is such a fascinating thing, the way that the power of the state collides with the local communities, so much more even in borderlands than it does elsewhere in a society. But also fascinating how in both these cases we've looked at a number of borders that are both hard, have been hard, then they become soft, but of course they can become hard again. I mean, the one between Bulgaria and Turkey, with the lovely kind of green picture with you all standing next to it, nature taking over. Well, of course, with the EU-Turkey deal, there's now enormous pressure on both Bulgaria and Turkey to stop migrants coming through that route. So there are parts of that.
There is
and
an
parts of
enormous
that
new
border
fence.
now have a new fence, a
Yeah.
newly built fence with,
Yeah.
with EU money. So yes, the local, the national, the international, this is all very mixed up. So Bram, I'd like to go to you because you have a great historical perspective on this. The Red Star Line Museum in Antwerp records the history of the people who left Europe for America in a period when they didn't need to have a passport or indeed a visa or even an ESTA, in a period when economic migrants, political refugees and everybody of any kind of status could leave for the United States. It's the European equivalent of Ellis Island. It's where people went before they got to Ellis Island on the other side, across the enormous border that is the Atlantic Ocean. But those stories are also poignant in their own way, because even if people were leaving willingly and they were going to what they hoped would be a brighter future without the kinds of constraints faced in Europe at the time, even so, leaving and arriving are always very difficult emotional moments. How do you try in the museum to portray the decisions they made, the people of that time?
We in the museum, so it's situated in a historical location. It's situated on the border, if you will. People only from third class. So you had the ships had first, second, and third class. Immigrants that traveled in third class, and they had to go through these checks, these health checks, to see if they, because American authorities, they didn't look for your reasons to emigrate, which is very important right now at this point. That wasn't the case at that time. It was totally your business how and why you migrated. But one thing was very important: the United States had to be able to use you. So if you weren't be able to work, if you weren't able if authorities thought you could be a liability, you could become a public charge, you weren't admitted to the country. Even if your life was in danger or you would fall under the Geneva Convention right now, you wouldn't have gone into the country. So all along the European ports, control stations, such as the ones our museum is in right now, is erected. And perhaps you could say it's also a little bit some sort of a prelude on what's happening now in the Sahara, because in the 1890s, thinking in America was we need to have more control on this massive influx of immigrants into the United States. There became a fear of those immigrants. It was not so much a political fear, but a fear of disease. You should know at that point people started to understand epidemiology in the big cities, the industrialized cities of the 19th century. Premature death, hunger was replaced by disease, and so immigrants, and especially from parts like Eastern Europe, Southern Europe, immigrants were seen as poorer, dirtier, unhealthier than, for example, people from Western Europe. So the United States put already in the 1880s, 1890s laws into effect to have these checks mandatory. And so then you could say, well, let's check them, like Ellis Island is there, in New York, when they come in, before they can go into the country. But then you would have the problem that if people were rejected en masse on Ellis Island, they would be there on the shores of the United States. We don't want that. We want to have some sort of a procedure where we have the controls on the other side of the big ocean.
Incredibly familiar.
Yeah. So they mandated the shipping companies that whoever was on their ship when arriving at New York at Ellis Island and they were rejected by the controls, the shipping companies had to deport or bring back to Europe the rejected passengers at their own costs. So shipping companies didn't want that. So they had all these checkpoints before embarkation. And when you go to Ellis Island, you get this story about how everybody came to Ellis Island, and there was a lot of tears, but only for 2% of the people. 98% of the people, it's 3 hours, and you're into the country. But if you look at the rejections in the department ports, rates are very much higher. It's like 10% and higher. So the ports of entry, such as Antwerp, such as Bremerhaven in Germany, such as Hamburg, they said, we don't want these people here either, because now we're at risk that they're becoming a liable charge. So they started to bicker with the American authorities, but the American authorities, the commercial interests were too high, so the American authorities in that discussion had some sort of an absolute power to enforce their will. So what did the ports say, or the shipping companies say? We will move the first control even further backwards. So we're in the 1890s. There is a big Austrian-Hungarian empire. There's Germany that extends in the eastward border, the Prussian border extends well into nowadays Poland and was bordering directly on Russia. So nearly everybody who departed from Russia and from Austria-Hungary and who wanted to go to the Atlantic ports had to pass through Germany. So all along the German border, there was the shipping companies themselves. They erected border control stations. So in the 1890s, when you left Russia to go to America, your first check actually was when exiting Russia. Therefore, the first time, people from the shipping companies would look if you were eligible to enter the United States. If you were eligible, you were put into specific carriages at the back end of the trains, which you couldn't leave, and you were ferried across Germany, ferried across Belgium. You were taken if you would come out of the central station in Antwerp, you would have been taken from the platform directly by a representative of the shipping company, taken to your hotel, taken to the boat, have your checks, and go on. So it was a very guided and also a very selective process, even from the start. This is of course not to say that in the 1920s and after the First World War, you have the rise of the nationalism and you have the start of modern thinking of borders, but also of modern thinking of, actually that for me as an historian, it's a very interesting parallel. You have thinking about modern borders, so seclusion and separation, but you also have the beginning of the thinking of international cooperation with the League of Nations and what is now the UN, so that kind of is parallel and also a little bit intertwined. But the selection process, even for the free United States, already happened way before that. And a big trigger for putting these controls into place was a cholera epidemic in Hamburg in 1892, when 8,000 people died of it. A lot of people then blamed Eastern, because the Asiatic cholera was an endemic at that time. So they blamed or thought it would have been immigrants on their way to America who introduced it. That was kind of the trigger for this system, the cholera. So I would like to ask you now, how many cases of cholera were actually found on the ships with immigrants? Zero. Voilà.
Voila.
This is so interesting because what you're describing in the late 19th century, I mean, it really is full circle, sorry for the pun, to what you started with, Bram, this idea of the border being pushed further and further away. That even though you had this massive sea border, the Atlantic Ocean or now the Mediterranean, that's not enough. No. Because once you're at the port, you can become a nuisance. Yep. So you make the shipping company, or these days the airlines, or indeed the fishermen and so on, responsible in some way. And so you keep pushing it further, and somehow the border can never be far enough away. Yep. And so you have this elaborate system for managing the movement of people to the border, to where they actually embark. So interesting the way that countries, but then also the private sector, have tried to manage all of this. And I'm curious with what all of you think about the fact that we're still having a huge debate about migration today. Migration has always been there. All of us are immigrants to Europe from probably Ethiopia. We all have a common ancestor in Ethiopia, some 46,000 years ago, I think it was. And yet we talk about migration as if it were a really recent phenomenon. It's always happened. It always will happen. And there are peaks and troughs in different places and so on. Has there been a time in history or in the different places that you've looked at where people have been really relaxed about migration? Or is it always a contentious issue of who belongs, who's part of the community, who should be allowed in? In the case of what you were talking about, Kapka, in a way the border has kind of shifted from one side of that fence to the other. It was Bulgarian border guards who were shooting people who wanted to leave Bulgaria. Now it's border guards trying to stop people from coming into Bulgaria because Bulgaria is an EU member state. So
the direction of movement has changed.
It shifts, the direction of movement has changed, and the kind of hostile side, the hard side of the border, the soft side of the border, changed. But is there, I'm thinking about, for example, if we go back further in history, the time of Mozart. Mozart, who was, of course, famously born in Salzburg, and who played in every capital city of Europe. And that was really normal for musicians at that time. That's how they made their living. And they would travel from Salzburg, it was German-speaking then. He would go to Prague, he would go to Bratislava, which was German-speaking at the time. He would travel to Paris, and he would play in each of these places without a passport. And that was really normal. There was this kind of, and it was that because people were more relaxed about borders in the empires of Austria-Hungary, and of course also in the
borders are 19th century nonsense, right? It's just a theory that every nation should have a state, and I mean, especially when you look at Africa. When you look at the crazy borders of Africa, where it's just like straight lines, because that's what the map in Berlin in 1884 looked like. I mean, this is mine, this is your Brits, French and Germans.
And in the Middle East, the same straight lines.
The same things, yeah. And so they are political constructs from the colonial powers, but still in Africa you have habits that are much older than those borders. So there are still people walking all the way from, as far as Somalia or Ethiopia, and then going down and then crossing from Zambia into Zimbabwe to go and work in the mines in Johannesburg. I mean, it's seriously still today, where, there's border guards, but they all know. I mean, I've spoken to many migrants who don't even have a passport, but they know that to cross the Zimbabwean South African border, it costs you, 20 euros. Everybody knows this. So there's still like fictitious things. I mean, I've seen borders between Senegal and Mali, which is just a rope hanging like here and here, and there you. I mean, it's fiction. So in a sense, migration. I mean, the African continent, and we are, all a result of a more liberal philosophy on migration from a long time ago. It's just become so much harder now.
It does seem to be, when you say it's a fiction, it's a fantasy, yeah, I think that I was very interested in touching the actual border, the actual Iron Curtain, so I was interested in the physicality of a hard border or a formerly hard border, but what struck me is that clearly that fence that we saw there, the Iron Curtain, only materialized in 1961, at the same time as the Berlin Wall went up. Before that, it was just natural topographic borders like the river that you showed. Yeah. The natural border between Bulgaria and Turkey is the river. Between Greece and Turkey, the river Evros. Between Bulgaria and Greece, mountain valleys. So really a physical border has only appeared, in the latter 20th century. And it first clearly appeared as a mental construct. It then materialized on the ground. It was then 2 generations later dismantled and sold for scrap. But some people continue to carry that border in their minds and in their hearts. And I talk to people who are damaged by that border on all sides, all 3 sides. They continue to live in this kind of with a siege mentality, with a paranoid mentality. They are the victims of the border. Some of these people are former border guards who killed people. So they are permanently damaged. And the fact that we continue carrying this concept or this fantasy in our minds makes it possible to materialize it and manifest it yet again on the ground, which is what we're seeing. So it's, I don't know.
What I find fascinating that at the same time, and roughly the same time, I also think in history, that construction of the border, or that fantasy of the border, is there and is coming more and more. At the other end, also the construction of human rights and of the freedom to go somewhere else and pursue your happiness, which is also kind of a construct, because you wouldn't have that in the Middle Ages or in the time of Mozart as you would have it now. At the same time, that is also all new. So, and it's almost like, and especially in relation to migration, I think in the time of when, for example, the Red Star Line was sailing, I've never found any debate about pro or contra migration or immigrant rights or immigrants as a class, and they should have specific rights or non-rights. You don't find that. That's something also very, very recent. So you have like some sort of the two ends of the...
Yeah, but I mean, Europe is thanking their wealth. I mean, Europe, in terms of wealth, was on the same level as China in 1493, a very famous year, where when the Portuguese decided, let's go out, and where the Chinese emperor said, no, we're going to stay here, we're going to make rice, and we don't need to explore the world. So the wealth gap between Europe and the rest of the world started increasing very rapidly from the 1500s. You know, I live in Cape Town, and there you still have a statue of a Dutch guy called Jan van Riebeeck, who was the first, Dutch immigrant coming by boat to the Cape in a time where there were no borders, when there was no issue, there was no debate about this. So the wealth accumulation for Europe would not have been possible without this border crossing.
But at the same time, that wealth accumulation, it came through exploitation, it came through genocide, it came through slavery. Yeah. So I think it's difficult and dangerous to look at that to argue about open borders today, because you can have one. We can't have one without the other.
Yeah, but I mean, still.
You're right. If you look at the remittances, for example, that Europeans in the United States were sending home to whole towns and whole regions at that time as well.
Still today, African migrants send 3 times more money back to Africa through remittances than all development aid together. So
it's huge. So I want to do a straw poll of the audience. How many people were born here in Brussels?
Oh, there you go.
This is a surprisingly large number for an audience. So this full circle's done really well. It's a truly Belgian institution. That's at least 10%. Very impressive. Because seriously, I found as an immigrant to Belgium, it's one of the most tolerant and welcoming countries, given the high proportion of migrants of all kinds into Belgium. And I'd like to open up also to all of you out there to also ask some questions about particularly trying to look at migration in this broader sweep of history, but also broader sweep geographically and of the human experience. In Brussels, there tends to be an obsession with migration policy, but that's not what we're going to talk about tonight. We're talking about the humans at the centre of it all. So what are your own experiences? What would you like to ask about? Gary?
A question for Kapka. The report, which I really loved. And I was intrigued because you were born in the border from Bulgaria, moved to New Zealand, then went to Scotland, right? Mm-hmm. There's some place in between. So I'd be intrigued by your thoughts. I'd be intrigued by your thoughts about national identity and whether you can shrug that off or it's something with you for life, a bit like the Jesuits said, give me a child till they're 18, they're mine for life. 7. Okay, 7.
They do it fast.
Nice quote. Yes, thank you for that question. Well, it's a complex question, isn't it? I'm not even sure that, when we talk about cultural identity, national identity, I'm not sure it exists, It's, a culture or a nation is something that is, if it's alive, that is in flux. So it's always changing, whereas an identity, we associate with something fixed. I don't really know, but I do know that I am drawn back to the Balkans. my next book is also about a part of the Balkans, which is shared by 3 countries. So, I mean, that's not nationally specific. But I suppose I'm drawn to the Balkans because they are because I'm a native of the Balkans, but also because I'm fascinated by in-betweenness. And Balkan culture is very much, a kind of mongrel, hybrid culture, straddling 2 or more worlds. So I'm interested in that. I don't know if that answers.
I just have a feeling from the book that for all its faults and all the criticisms you leveled at your home country, that you still felt as though that was home for you. I was just wondering if you can ever really get over that.
Yeah, I don't think you can ever get over early childhood experiences, and I think this is a sentence I often quote because I like it from an Argentinian writer, Andrew Graham Yole, who wrote a wonderful book, A State of Fear, about the Argentinian junta. But he said to me once, I asked him, why did you return to Argentina from long years of exile in London? And he said, because Argentina is where my love and my anger are. And I think it comes down to these things.
Yes, and I wonder if there's also an element here of how much national identity is being drummed into you as a child. I'm just thinking of the 3 countries that Kapka's book is about. The Turkish educational system from a very young age instills very strongly the sense of Turkish national identity to override all ethnic and religious differences in the country. It's a very Jacobite system. Greece too, to a certain extent. And of course, one of the most important things that happened in the post-Yugoslav era was the provision of a common curriculum in, for example, Bosnia to teach history, which has now disappeared. And now children growing up in Bosnia learn 3 different versions of history depending on the national identity within Bosnia that they are, the community that they're growing up in.
It's a catastrophe.
So, yes,
what's happened?
Yeah,
it's a catastrophe.
But I'm just suggesting perhaps this national identity question is constructed.
And very dangerously constructed often, I feel, because loving your country often requires you to also hate your neighbours.
Yeah.
You mentioned identity. I've done some projects with the British Council, and very quickly, sometimes musicians, you mentioned Mozart, actually their nationality is musician, it actually transcends national borders. But a very quick Balkan story, with the British Council is a wonderful female composer, Zidika, from Kosovo. And I was doing a project with a violin colleague of mine in Macedonia, and we, through the British ambassador, were able to grab this girl, get her to come over on a coach, very rickety road, get her to Macedonia, to Skopje, and to work with the Macedonian army musicians. And they had 2 problems. First of all, one, they didn't really want to work with this girl from Kosovo because these were men. And so they were very reticent about the whole experience. Once they saw her talent, suddenly they were all friends, and her nationality being musician suddenly superseded that she was actually a Muslim. I didn't mention that she was Muslim, they weren't. And the other thing, which in that story, we were given a translator. One of the guys, the French horn player, could speak quite good English, so he was our guy. And we went across this fantastic bridge to the Muslim side in Skopje. And he said, why are we going here? Because we said, well, the food's good. The British Council give us money to spend on people like him. And then we got to the restaurants, but the food's the same as ours. And we kept saying, but this is your city. And that's actually something where Mozart actually has his strength. It sort of cuts across those borders, and actually people are the same, but they're told they're not quite often. That's a little story.
Back to those songs, is it a
song? Yeah. So what, do we need borders? Let's have a vote. Can we do without borders? It'd be very interesting.
And what kind as well? I mean, Schengen borders, which you just say, oh, look, I'm passing to the Netherlands now, and I'll be in Germany soon. Are those the kinds of borders we need? Well, that's the question I'd actually like to pose to Bram, because what you were describing was the erection of borders in Europe in order to kind of protect the commercial interests because of what the US authorities were. But at that point in history, most of the people who were arriving in Antwerp to take the Red Star Line didn't need passports. They didn't need any other way of reaching it. It was just because of the American authorities. But would borders have made a difference at that point?
In Europe? That's actually a hard question to answer, because you're now asking me to invent an alternative history at the spot, which is even for me quite a lot.
Well, it was almost like it is now. I mean, it was at that point rather like it is now, that the internal border, the external border was hard. It's the praline syndrome. The external border is hard and the internal border is soft. And the external border was to the US at that point, as it still is now. But then in the meantime, then we had the kind of breaking up of Europe into nation states.
I think the thing also is, so there was control, there was selection, there was a border, but at the end of the day, American was a country in vast expansion. I think my point would be a little bit like the construction of the land of the free and everybody's welcome. That was false. But they took in a massive amount of immigrants, and because they were in a land of expansion. I think that's a big difference of Europe today, because we're talking about the borders that are up now the last few years, but I think in essence Europe has had that, or European states have had that border from around the Second World War. For example, those of Belgium, you had the guest worker system in the 60s, then in the 70s it closed, you had the oil crisis and so on, and from then some very specific people were allowed in, and refugees, and with the Convention of Geneva and the international legal framework and so on. So these borders were already there, and does it make a difference? It doesn't really make a difference. It makes a difference. And this is a little bit my own take of it. But for example, in 1921 and 1922, US really said they imposed quota. So there were only this much people allowed into the country. That was after the First World War with the nationalism. And what you see then in Antwerp is all of a sudden an explosion of illegal migration, of people who are getting destitute, of people who are getting under the radar. People are booking tickets to Canada and trying with. You had you couldn't drink alcohol, the prohibitions. Yeah, you had the prohibition, so you had all these liquor smuggling routes along the Canadian border, and they would take these immigrants as well. So there's this ambition or this drive of people when they want to get somewhere. If there's inequality in wealth between nations or between parts of the world, and I think borders, when politicians say we need this we have to scare them away. You need something to scare them away. I don't see it happen. I never really seen it happen. Also, not in the period that I studied. When migration really came to a stop from Europe to the United States, that was the 1930s, because you had the Great Depression and you had the economical incentive that disappeared, not so much the border.
Yeah. I just want to bring in somebody who might give us the argument for borders.
Yeah.
Why would you think that I would give the argument for borders?
Well, you posed the question. Do we?
I see. Now, I just wanted to comment that you spoke about two kinds of borders, the soft one and the hard one. You mentioned the border so hard that even miles away you cannot even get nearer, or the one where you would have to go with all the papers to, the borders you were saying was getting further and further. I've come to know a third kind of border, which is more like a filter. So I grew up in the Jewish settlement in the West Bank. I don't know if that's why you thought I would be in favor of borders, but basically over there it's very strange, because going from the same West Bank into Israel, if you're Jewish, it's super easy. Yeah. So basically it's enough for the soldier to say to me, "Hi, how are you?" and they would listen to my accent, and I could do it by walking or hitchhiking. Whereas if I were a Palestinian from the same territory, if the authorities, there are many who go and work in Israel and go back the same day, but if the authorities decide basically there's a curfew or tension, there's no possible way. Well, there are ways, and there are smugglers, and sometimes they succeed, but it's very difficult. Yeah. And Heather, you mentioned that this is a very open-minded place here, Brussels. Now I'm jumping a few years ahead into where I live now. So I live now in Molenbeek, And it's always very absurd to me how I've been in this country for just a few years and not a citizen, and the police would never stop me on the street or try to ask me for papers. But my neighbors could be third generation in this country, but they don't have the right color or the right dress code, and they're the ones who are still being asked about their identities and about their legitimacy. So yes, for people like us who are educated and white and come from rich countries, it's quite easy to move into, but there's another Brussels which is very different. So in both cases, and I'm making this rough comparison, which is, you can challenge on many levels between being a second, third generation migrant in Europe today, where I grew up. In both cases, it's really about your identity rather than the physical border.
And effectively, borders for, let's say, me or people like me with the red passport, you know, me being born in Holland, actually don't exist. Let's be honest, you know. It's like, yeah, I can go wherever I want. I've never been told, at least by not an African country, that I couldn't come. You know, I can get my visa on arrival.
I have 3 passports and I'm entitled to 2 others. I really have no problem to go wherever.
Exactly. Yeah. So effectively, borders only exist for the poor. You know, and I always make the comparison between, you know, why are we so stressed out when we see pictures with people, you know, boats full of people getting over the Mediterranean, but when I go to Schiphol airport, I get in a queue which is even more massive, and we call that what, you know? There's no problem with that. No, I agree with your point.
Back. See, Nick, I know you've got an question.
I just had a thought when you were asking the question, do we need borders anymore? That maybe borders, and actually a lot of migration, are becoming old-fashioned in a sense. That you pointed out that the economic differences between countries have grown enormously, that they weren't very large in 1492 and so on, for the majority of the population, whereas now there are ratios of like 50-1 between some countries. And that, I don't know if it makes borders necessary. It makes it necessary for some, anyway. But an increasing number of borders are there to police the relationship that you have with the state and the relationship economic relationships that you have, which also affect the state in terms of taxation and so on. If it's true in getting to an information society and so on, then an increasing number of the transactions and relationships we have, it doesn't matter which side of the border you're on, you'll have exactly the same relationship. And the rules that try and fit it into borders become increasingly absurd. I mean, I have a rule that I'm allowed to telework in Antwerp or Mons, but not in Lille. You know, you're not allowed to, it has to be in Belgium, you do teleworking. It just seems a bit absurd the moment you say it. An increasing number of the regulations that are based on borders will acquire that absurdity. I mean, if you have the collaborative economy allowing you to supply software from India to Germany, then the business that happened about 20 years ago of moving Indians physically to Germany in order to do software work seems very 20th century. So maybe borders are becoming, physical borders are becoming technologically obsolete. But the point that was just made that you're talking about second generation, third generation facing a very different Brussels from people who've just arrived. Well, I haven't just arrived, but some of us have. I was at a meeting this week about migration at work, and someone commented, they were living in Belgium, that they often we use the concept of people with a migrant background rather than immigrants or people with a different citizenship, because the second generation and third generation face much more difficulties than the first generation. Now, there's a story in lots of countries that the second and third generation do, in the States, for instance, there's a story in some extent in reality that the second and third generation do better than the first generation system. That's true for everyone except African Americans, I think, which is a different kind of relationship. But you'd think that if you're talking about those non-physical borders, that the second and third generation should do better, and that would be an index of how successful a country is at moving beyond those non-physical borders, while technology might move us beyond the physical borders.
So I have a question then for the panel, because we're reaching the close as well, which is really about this conundrum that as we move into the digital age where we could, in theory, work anywhere, and where we Europeans with European passports are fortunate enough that we probably can still at the moment. And yet this is a moment when there's a massive political reaction against the idea of giving up control of borders and amongst other things. Is this a throwback? Is it a bit like the election of Trump, that as we move towards a more and more borderless age and people feel a loss of control over their lives, just the physicality of borders becomes symbolically so much more important, because that is literally the edges of the state, which are being eroded all the time through globalization. Every country in the world is losing sovereignty because you can't, no one country can manage its affairs on its own anymore. In a globalized economy with digital revolution happening, essentially governments everywhere are losing control. And so the border is perhaps the one thing where they can always put more soldiers with guns, they can put in more barbed wire.
Yeah.
Is this obsession with borders becoming bigger, and this obsessive conversation about migration, no matter what the number of arrivals is in any given year, simply people holding on to something that used to have the semblance of security in an age where everything is becoming fuzzy borders?
Yeah. So in a world where you're becoming increasingly globalized and increasingly unable to control anything, borders gives that sense of security. I mean, in America you had this thing where Trump was sending how many thousand soldiers to the border, and at the same time there's a shooting in a synagogue. Security what? I mean, borders don't give you security. It just gives you a false sense of security. So I just wanted to mention this. I mean, there are no actual borders when it comes to capital flows, right? So I went to the island of Sicily, where the Italian police had just lifted a migrant boat up. It was the biggest maritime disaster since the Second World War. 700 migrants had died on that boat, and they had lifted the boat for the first time to actually identify the people that had died. And at the very place where that boat was lifted, you could see the oil pipeline from Libya coming ashore in Europe, flowing freely, while those people, were dying there. So, it is a borderless world, actually, just not for, people don't.
It's not for everyone.
Not for everyone.
Some are more equal than others.
Yeah.
I mean, I think for us to kind of tell ourselves that we live in a borderless world, that we are that globalization is kind of an ever-accelerating process is to fool ourselves a little bit. I think it's a privileged position when you've seen what happens in actual borderlands, that it's still a life and death situation for people. Yeah. But I think it is largely gestural, this physical building of new, bigger, brighter borders that we've seen. Eastern Europe kind of leads the way, Hungary, Bulgaria, Greece. Eastern Europe seems to be especially kind of allergic to, to the idea of taking in immigrants. Someone has described it as a deficit of compassion. There's a whole host of reasons for that, to do with post-communism and various other sort of neuroses in those societies. But I think it's largely a gestural thing. It's clutching at straws, It's distracting us, To build a new shiny border, I think, is just a way to distract us from the intractable problems of our age, which is inequality within our societies, but also across the world.
Is there no one here that wants that actually supports borders? Then is that what I got from the? Yeah.
Go for it. The microphone's coming to you. And of course, remember that all of these pressures are going to get bigger with Triptych number 3 of this series on climate migration. And of course, techno-migrants, that these climate and digital are going to increase the pressure for people to move in various ways. So what will borders be like at that age? Go ahead.
Well,
see you.
I suppose Nick made what was, if your name is indeed Nick. Yeah, okay, good. He made an important point about the definition of a state. And I think that one of the things that we blithely, maybe it's a Brussels audience, have skated over is managing to have a conversation about migration without any mention of the modern welfare state. And where the Theo Frankens of this world have a great deal of leverage is to talk to the Belgian population about, do we think that foreigners who come in and have contributed nothing into the system have rights about what they get out of the system? Now, some of those rights are given to them by UN accords and European rules about equality of treatment. I'm not sure I'm going to defend borders, but I want to put up there that actually the Western European welfare state is a very important element in people trying to hold on to borders, because the borders define the state, and they think, the general population, a lot of them thinks that that definition of the state should then dictate what entitlements are. And they struggle with how migration fits into that. Very quick mention, you've talked a lot about emigration to the United States. And of course, where you basically have a much smaller welfare state, you're more reliant on self-help, then the arguments are rather different. So it may be peculiar to Western Europe.
Well, we get deep into a set of policy issues, but I just observed two things. One thing is that, of course, European countries that have contributory systems, like Belgium, where you actually don't get things back unless you've contributed, for example, the mutuelle for your healthcare and so on. It's a very different situation than, for example, the UK, which has a non-contributory system, which is one of the reasons for the obsession with EU migrants. But let's not go there. Let's not go in the British direction, especially not this week. But the other really critical thing about all of this is this anxiety point. That regardless of the realities of whether migrants can access welfare benefits, anxiety about the future of the state and what the state can provide seems to be one of the major drivers, particularly in Northern Europe, the Netherlands, for example, but also Scandinavia and Finland, the Nordic countries, about migration. But because we're not going to go into migration policy, I would perhaps just segue from that into a final question, starting with Bram. Okay, about...
Is it on that?
Sorry?
I've just got the list as
Oh, you wanted to answer the one about you're going to make the case for borders?
No.
Okay, go ahead.
I don't think there are not many people that want to make the case for borders, so I'm preaching to the converted in this room. But what I wanted to say, you're answering, do we need borders? I think borders are there to maintain the status quo, and that is, of course, if you want to maintain the status quo, you have an interest to pull up a border, and that's, I think, as old as mankind. I was there's a museum, I think it's the National Museum of History in Parc Saint-Contenaire, where there's an interactive map of Europe, and you see from, I think, 500 before Christ until now, you see the movement of people throughout Europe, and you see literally people going from the north of Scandinavia to northern Africa, and they're just moving around, and you just ask yourself, why on earth do they all want to move? Because it's a hassle to have to leave your own place, and so the question is more why are there borders, but why do people want to leave? Why do you want to border move, crossing from one place to the other?
Okay, so the historian I think has to answer that one. Why do people move?
In search for a better life. But what I wanted to say, because we're talking about borders, we're talking about the nation states, we're talking about why do people vote for Theo Franken and for Trump. I think a lot has to do with the social welfare system. Classical opponents to a liberal migration policy are unions to protect inland labor's right. But you cannot say that Theo Franken is a socialist, or you cannot say that, I think a lot of people are voting now for identitary reasons, for identity, to protect their identity. And I think that has to do, regardless if there's borders, and this is an evolution that is unstoppable, I think, is that all the countries are becoming more diverse. So even if the border stays within the border, that you have this togetherness of a dominant ethnicity or dominant nation within the borders of the state, that is really disappearing, and I think that's unturnable. And for me, I think it's interesting to see within the future people like Trump or people like Theo Franken. Is it a backlash, or is it like a fight in the rear guard?
The last gasp.
Yeah.
Yeah. So is it about identity?
No, I mean, I always make most of the people here are not from here, right? So people want to strive. There's nothing, I don't think there's anything different between, most of the people here and anyone in Senegal or whatever. People want to strive, people want to move forward. I was born in a very small village in Holland. I didn't stay there. I had to go where the universities were, and then you go where the capital is. It's just normal kind of behavior. And often in Africa, I find that migration wasn't just established in the last 10 years or 20 years by very direct economical needs, but often it turns out that people from certain villages in Senegal have been migrating because of 150 years ago the French took them to Paris, actually, and families started living there, and because you have family there, you will go there easier. So there's a path there. So why do people migrate? I don't know. It's just it's also interesting, isn't it? Just to go around.
Yeah, there's lots of paradoxes, I think, around all of this. And I think one of the paradoxes is that, someone mentioned status quo. Well, the Iron Curtain and the Berlin Wall did a very successful job of keeping the status quo. That was the Cold War for a while, as we know. And there's something to be said about that. We mentioned empires before. Movement of people was free within empires. But, do we recommend empires? We probably don't. Do we recommend a return to the Cold War? We probably don't. But with the fall of the Iron Curtain, millions of people, and I'm one of them, started leaving a certain part of Europe for the rest of the world in search of a better life. And now we are living with the consequences of that. So Brexit really is an indirect consequence, of this huge influx of Eastern Europeans into Britain. We are living with the consequences. We just, are we up for it?
And here again,
these are the paradoxes.
Yeah. So perhaps just a final thought to leave everybody with before we thank the panelists is, are borders something that we cling to almost out of psychological need rather than physical? Is it something that we feel we need to have control, to have an identity? Or is that just something we've been taught? And when we look back in history, we can see other periods when things were different. And when we look forward in history, we can see that things might be different there too. When we no longer have these little books with the red covers, and instead we have our biochips implanted of our digital identity chips implanted in our wrists, that might be, will be forever identifiable, but not necessarily within particular borders. So I can have only to thank the panel and to recommend the next two images in this triptych. This was the first. There will be the next one on techno-migrant in January next year, and the third one on fast-forward climate migration in April next year. And we hope to see you there. And thanks for the panel.